Well, my name's Gary Mathis. I am one of the owners of the Force Syndicate LLC. I was actually the person who started the company, and I started out with a project called Blabaway about 2 years ago. Actually, more than that. Back in 2011 is when I started building the Blabaway website. That was back whenever I started learning more about PHP and different things that you can do with the frameworks that there was back then. And the next thing I wanted to be able to do is well, I started out, it was just basic PHP code. A lot of times I was actually mixing my MySQL statements and my HTML and my actual PHP code together, which is not good. You want to kind of keep everything separate. You want to keep your MySQL queries inside of a model. You want to keep your PHP logic inside of a controller, and then you also want to keep your HTML inside of a view. You kind of want to keep them all separate from each other as much as you can. Now there is times where it may not be possible, or it may be really hard to keep them separate, but the best that you can keep them separate, the better. Because later on you may have some other developer come in, play with your code a little bit, try to change things, and it just gets nasty from there. So about 2.5 years ago, I started working on a rebuild of Blabaway. I wanted to be able to scale the website a little bit better on a bigger machine and things like that. So I built a framework. It was called Basic MVC back then, um, and it was a model view controller framework. It's completely object oriented. Um, it allowed for a lot of different things that had a MySQL class built into it, and then later on I built a MySQL I class for the MySQL improved PHP extension. Um, and at this point, the basic MVC framework doesn't actually support multiple servers. It only supports one server. Of course, you can have a secondary MySQL server, so you can have an offsite MySQL database, which is fine. Any PHP script should be able to do that. But at this point, I'm using about 75% of my load on my server, which is a lot. But it's not too much for the server. I'm running a 24 core Intel Xeon server with 48 gigs of DDR3 RAM with memory correction, and then I have four 1 terabyte drives with a RAID 10. That gives me a little bit of extra boost and a little bit extra performance. But at peak times, I'm using usually anywhere around 75% to 80% of my CPU, which is not really all that good. So I'm to the point now where I need to be able to start working with multiple servers, multiple instances, maybe move the whole system over to the cloud. So Basic MVC is actually retiring. And I'm gonna replace the basic MVC framework with another framework. Originally, I was going to call it Scale MVC, but that kind of sounded lame. And the new one probably don't sound much better to you. It's called PHP Steroid. So the new framework is going to be called PHP Steroid. So what I have here, so I went and bought a domain. Actually, I went and bought a domain. It's phpsteroid.com. That's the domain that we'll be working with. And what I did is I created a droplet inside of DigitalOcean. So I just spun up a server inside of DigitalOcean. That's the IP address. Doesn't matter. And the only thing I've really done to this server is actually enable Apache mod rewrite, and that's basically all I've done to the server. I deleted the default files within the PHP default directory, which is at /var/www/htdocs or /HTML actually. So that's pretty much all I've done to the server. So that's the story about how this tutorial series came across. I figured why not document it. This will help people out in the future. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to start with creating one file. Those will be called the index.php file. So this file will actually have every single page load come through it. And what we want to do inside of this file, first thing, is we want to turn on our error reporting, and that'll be all. And then I'm going to make sure error reporting is on within my ini through the script. So I'm going to do ini set, and I'm going to do display errors, and I'm going to set that to a value of 1. Okay, so now we have error reporting on, and if I do something crazy right here and come over and refresh this page, notice error reporting is indeed on. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and call the globals variable, and this inside of this variable I'm going to create an array object, and I'm going to call it config. So this is where our actual config is going to live for our application. Later on we'll move this error reporting and this ini set to a different place, but for now this is a great place for that to happen. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create another variable, and I'm going to call it app name, and I'm going to set that equal to PHP Steroid. We'll use this a little bit later on. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set our domain equal to PHP Steroid.com. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set some paths. So I'm going to create a path variable, and I'm going to set that equal to an array. Within this array, I'm going to set app equal to app /, and then I'm going to come down and set core equal to core /, and then I'm also going to create one more variable inside of this. I'm going to say index is equal to index.php, and I'll tell you the reason I'm doing this here in just a little bit. Okay, so for now we want to create another variable, and I'm going to call this defaults, and I'm going to set this equal to an array. Within this array, I'm going to create another variable. I'm going to call it controller. I'm going to set this equal to main, and another controller called method. Another variable called method. And I'm going to set this to index. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create another variable here, and I'm going to call this routes. This will be where we actually define our custom routing. And for now, I'm just going to leave that equal to an empty array. And then I'm going to come down and create another variable called database. And this is where our database configuration will live in our app, or inside of our framework. And a database usually has 4 variables, such as a host. And on this server, it's just a basic LAMP server, so it's already got MySQL installed. So I'm going to set that to localhost. And then username, I'm going to leave that blank for now. Password, I'm going to leave that blank as well. The next thing I'm going to do is create the last variable, and this will be the name of our database. And if you're following along, forgive me if I'm going too fast. If you want, you can go ahead and pause the video, get all these configurations down, because this is pretty much it for the config variable for now. Later on, we'll be adding more to it and taking stuff away as needed if we need. The next thing we'll do is I'm going to say require once, and I'm going to focus on this this globals variable, because if we change it in this globals variable, it should actually take effect across the entire framework. You don't want to have to repeat yourself. So config, and then I'm going to look at the path. So I'm looking here, and then I want to look at the core path. So core, and the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna append autoload.php. So right now, what we have is we're just including our autoload, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the autoload here in just a second. So the next thing we want to do is we want to start defining our actual structure of our framework. So what I'm doing here is I'm just inside of my root directory creating a folder called app and creating another folder called core. Okay, inside of the app folder, we want to create let's see here, 6 folders. The first folder is going to be called abstracts. The second folder is going to be called controllers. The third folder is going to be called interfaces. The fourth folder is going to be called libs. The fifth folder is going to be called models. The sixth folder is actually going to be called views. Okay, inside of our core folder, we want to create 3 folders. The first folder is going to be called abstracts. The second folder is going to be called classes. And the third folder is going to be called interfaces. Okay, so now we have our basic structure. We'll add more to it later. We're going to create one more file inside of our app directory, and we'll call it autoload.php. Okay, inside of this autoload, we want to, actually I'll just do that for you. Inside of our autoload function, our PHP file, we're going to call a function that's built into PHP. It's called SPL_autoload_register. And what that function does is it takes another function, an anonymous function, as a parameter. And this kind of looks like JavaScript for a second. And what this function is doing is it's saying if we call a class that does not exist in the project yet, then we want to find it and include it for the code. That way the code does not stop working. So what this function does is it goes and searches all of our app directories except for the views folder inside of the app folder, because the views folder will actually take HTML and things like that. So what that's doing is if the PHP code does not have a class by that defined name, when you're constructing a new class, it goes and finds that class for you. So you don't have to actually require it. You don't have to have a huge list of require parameters and things like that, which can easily become hundreds of lines of code. So the next thing we want to do is inside of our classes folder. So inside of this classes folder, we want to create a new file, and this is going to be called router.php. Inside of this router class, so inside of this class, we'll have a variable that's going to be private routes. It's going to not have a value at the beginning. Then we're going to create a function, and we're going to call this function construct. So basically what this function will do is it will allow us to create basic routing functions within our configuration variable. So that's our end goal in this class here. So we're going to say this routes equals globals config routes. Okay, so now what we're doing is we're setting this variable, and the word this actually says, hey, I'm going to be talking to my current instance, which is the instance of a router, and we're going to say this routes, so this variable, is equal to whatever is inside of this array. So now what we're going to do is underneath here we'll say route equals this find route. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to create this function called find route. So this function will be a private function. So this class will only be this. Basically, what the private keyword says is the only thing allowed to use this function is this class. So this current instance is the only thing allowed to use it. So within this find route, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to run a for each statement, and we're going to say this routes as route. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a variable. We're going to have a variable inside of here, and we're going to say parts equals this route part. And we're going to pass down this route. So now what we're going to do next is, since this function don't exist yet, we're going to create it. So we'll say private function route part, and we'll say route. The next thing we're going to do inside of this route part function is we're going to do about two things. And these two things is going to equal 4 lines of code. We're going to say parts, or that's going to be equal to 5 lines of code. Sorry. We're going to say if is array route. So if this route is an array, then we're going to say route equals route URL. And this may not make sense yet, but it will here in just a second. So from there, we're going to say parts equals explode. So what the explode function does is it takes two parameters. It takes a delimiter, and it takes a variable, a string. And what it's doing is it's taking this string and it's splitting it up by this parameter, so this delimiter. So now what we have is an array. And from this array, we can do multiple things, which we'll do here in just a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that array and I'm going to return it. Now that we have that function written, we can do another for each loop. So it's a loop within our loop, pretty much. So we're saying for each parts as key equals value. And what we're going to do is we're going to search the URL and make sure that the route matches the current URL. If it does, let's return that route. But what we need to do is we'll say function URI, and this will say part So what this function is going to do, it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to say parts equals explode, and it's going to take our delimiter again. From that delimiter, it's going to scan basically a server specified parameter, if that makes sense. So there's a variable. It's a magic global, and it's actually $_server all caps, and that's basically the parameters that the server is reading. And inside of that array, we're going to look at the request URI. From there, we can say if parts 1 is equal to this global's config path index. So basically what we're looking at is we're saying this config, we're looking inside of the path, and we're looking at this index variable. So the next thing we want to do is we're going to say if that is equal to that, we're going to say part plus plus. Now we'll say return, we'll say return, and we'll do kind of like a it's almost like an if statement. It's called a ternary statement. Sorry, I couldn't say that. And what an ternary statement does is this part's the if statement. This part says I'm in a ternary statement. This part's true, and this is kind of like the else statement. So this is false. So we're going to say if is set part return part. If not, let's just return a blank screen. Won't hurt anything. So now what we need to do is we need to create another variable above this for each statement, and we'll call it all match. We'll set that equal to true by default. Okay, now we'll say if value is not equal to an asterisk. So in our case, what this is going to say is asterisk means anything, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that here in just a second. We're just going to write this code out a little bit further, and then we'll say if this is not true, or rather than if it is an asterisk, we'll skip over. So if it's not an asterisk, we'll say if router URI. Oh, this URI function needs to be static. Sorry about that. So if URI key is equal to value, or shall I say not equal to value, then all match should equal to false. Now underneath this variable, we'll say return, we'll say if all match return route. So now what we're doing is we're saying, hey, go through all of our route items here inside of this array, and for each one, let's see if we have a match. If we do have a match, let's return it and not continue any longer. Now, what happens here if we don't have a match? Well, it won't return anything, so this function will always need to return something. So how do we handle that? The answer to that is we come underneath our main for each loop here, and we'll say URI1 is equal to router URI1. And we'll do that a second time. And we'll say URI2. So now we'll say if URI1 is equal to nothing, then URI1 needs to equal whatever our default is over here. So globals configs defaults. So global config default controller. Now we pretty much need to do the same thing here with URI2. So if URI2 equals nothing, then URI2 needs to be equal to global config default method. Okay, so that should make a little bit more sense. Now we'll say route is equal to an array. And inside of this array, we'll say controller is equal to URI1. Okay, and then method needs to be equal to URI2. And we'll finally return this route. So now, even if this return doesn't return anything, if it does, the class ends right there. So this method will end as soon as this says, hey, return that. But if it never returns anything, we'll go build out a return statement. So now this variable will always be filled. We'll come into something new. We'll say if class exists, and we'll look at our class name, which should be basically equal to, I'm trying to say, see how we can word this. So our route is an array, right? Inside of our array, we have the controller variable, and we'll say else here, and I'll tell you what to do there in just a second. We'll then say, since that class exists, so basically what the function is doing is not just saying, hey, does the class exist? It's saying, if it don't exist, let's try to load it. If it can't load it, then it don't exist. So now, what it's doing is it's going and trying to see if it can dynamically load that controller. If it cannot, then it will fail and go to this else statement. So now what we need to do is we need to say controller is equal to new route controller. And done. So what we're doing here is we're dynamically creating a variable and calling this class. So basically what we're saying is we're using the keyword new, just like we would do with a class, but we're also saying, hey, take whatever's in the content of this variable and represent that as a class by doing that behind it. So now what we need to do is we need to say if method exists, and we're going to pass our controller down as the first parameter. Now we're going to say route method as our second parameter, and we'll add our else statement there as well. So now it's saying if that method exists within whatever class this is, then we'll run that method. So we'll say controller route method, and that's how that runs. So what we're doing is we're saying call whatever class this is and call whatever the content of this variable is as a method, inside of that class. So basically, PHP is dynamically calling a class and a method at this point. So now we need to attend to these else statements. So inside of this classes folder, we need to create a new class. A new class, and we'll call it error.php. Right? So now that we have a class, we'll say class error, and we'll create one function inside of that, and that's going to be show. And we'll say type, and we'll say echo type. Actually, I'll do this. Type error. And that's all this class will have for now. And we'll say error. Actually, inside that class, this function should be static. So now what we'll say is we'll call error show 404, since that does not exist. And we'll do the same thing here that don't exist. So now what we're doing is, if this class is not found, then we're dynamically loading the error class and calling this function within it. So that's all fine and dandy. But what we have here is we can reload that. We have nothing happening here. So inside of our index.php page, we should probably say new router. So now, if I refresh, I get an error. Undefined index default on line 55 and line 58. So line 55 and line 58 has an error. So we'll say config default config. Oh, oops. Sorry, that was my mistake. I used the plural form inside of the configs, which is fine. So now we got a 404 error because our default don't exist. We're not calling it. So what we need to do is, inside of our app, we'll create a new file, and I'll call this main.php. Inside of our main.php, I'll do this. I'll say class main, and I'll say function index, and I'm going to echo main index. So now if I refresh, I should get my main index. And if I come over here and say function foo, I'll echo main foo. But what we should be able to do is we should be able to say /main/foo. But that's not found. I'm getting an Apache page not found. So I said at the beginning of this video, this is just a DigitalOcean install, and I enabled the module mod rewrite inside of Apache. The reason that the framework saying this is not found, and this is the reason I used this this index variable here, just to show you guys. If I went to /index/main/foo, or /index.php, sorry, this actually works. So you asked me why I put the index path there. The reason I did that is because I don't want to have to put index.php on every page. So the way around that is I'll go ahead and collapse these to make it easier to see. I'll say new empty file, and I'm going to call this .htaccess. Instead of our .htaccess file, we'll have a couple things happen. We'll turn on our rewrite engine, and I'm going to set a rewrite rule, and I'll say .index.php, which is great. I should be able to keep that there, works just fine. I should be able to remove that, and it worked just fine. And it does. But what happens if we have a CSS file or something like that, maybe inside of an assets directory? Well, that would not work. It would redirect all that to this index.php file, which could not end, should not end well. So what we want to do is we'll say disable for these file types. And we'll say rewrite condition, and we'll use this parentheses and open and closing curly braces, and we'll say not /dot CSS, and then we'll put a $sign there. Where my $sign is. Inside of this curly braces, we want to put request request URI, which is a server variable. So we're saying if the file extension is not equal to CSS, then do that. So any file type will work through this index.php except for CSS at this point. But you may ask me, what if I want more file types? Well, you can just continue going, but always remember that the last one cannot have the $sign. So we'll do a couple more: PNG, JPG, JS, maybe a zip file, maybe a CS, no, well, maybe an HTML file. Okay, so that's how that works. So now if I come over here, I'm going to get the same result no matter what. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create one more class, or actually two more classes inside of this classes folder. The first class we want to create is our load class. Don't get this confused with this auto load, because if you notice this auto load scans all these directories, what this load class will actually do is it will only look at one directory, and that's app views, because our views is always going to be a glorified HTML file, if you will. So what we'll do is we'll say PHP, and we'll say class load, and inside of that class we'll have a static function view. Now PHP has a function, I think it's called the extract function, right? So what the extract function will do is it will extract an array of key values, which sounds weird. So let me show you just what I mean. So I might say file name. Actually, we'll say view file, and then view vars is equal to a blank array. So what we'll do is we'll pass this down, and there's a quick way to, another way to do this in PHP is we can do it like this, which is basically saying, hey, define a variable based off the content of this key So we're doing a for each through this array. Create a variable dynamically based off the content of this key, whatever it's equal to, and set that variable equal to the value of that key, which is pretty weird. And PHP is tremendously slower than its parent programming language, which is C. So PHP is written in C, and its parent programming language implements the extract function into PHP. And the extract function does exactly the same thing. So now what we'll do is we'll do file check, our view file. Is equal to explode. And remember that the explode function splits a string up into an array of strings. So we'll say explode view file. Now what we'll do is we'll say if not is set, view file check 1. So basically what we're doing is we're looking for a file extension. And if that file extension is not set, then what we're going to do is we're going to append it to the end of the string. And that's going to be a .php file. But if it exists, we're not going to touch the file extension. We'll just read whatever the user put in there for us. So now we'll say view file, view file. And this is just to make things easier on other programmers, because I've seen this a lot. Not a string repeat, it'll be a string replace. And what we're searching for is : Now, a lot of people like to use the : as maybe a directory. So maybe our / instead of a directory structure. So if you see how I'm calling a static function here and using : well, a lot of people like to use that same method for directories. So what we'll do is we'll do that for them. We'll make it easier for them. So now we'll say require once, and we'll say globals config path app, and we'll append views / whatever our file name is. So our view file. And we're done with that function. So now we can dynamically load views within our controller. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create a placeholder, or something our controllers can extend. So we'll create our default controller, and we'll say class controller. And that's the only thing this class is going to have in it for now. So now, if we come into our controllers and hit main, we can say extend controller. So what we have now is we have the bare bones of our framework. And it's starting to come into, it's starting to come into shape a little bit. The next thing we'll do is we'll work on a couple of things. Database connectivity we'll work on next. So I want to build a MySQL I class. We'll probably implement the exact same class that Basic MVC has, because Basic MVC, its strong suit is database. But what we're going to do is we're going to implement that class, but we're going to go a lot further with it and build a query builder into this class, and possibly query caching. So that's it for now, guys. Stay tuned. I got another video coming soon. And keep on keeping on.